Welcome to this Brave Feminine Leadership interview where I am digging into a series of conversations with CEOs. As a former CEO, I'm always incredibly passionately interested to hear others' stories of their journeys. And today I'm absolutely thrilled to be joined by Jeanne Johns. Jeanne, welcome to our podcast.
Thank you, Melissa. It's a pleasure to be here.
Let me share with the audience, Jeanne, a little bit about your bio briefly. So Jeanne Johns is the former Managing Director and CEO of Incitec Pivot, a world-leading industrial explosives and fertilizers organisation. This follows an impressive 30-year career at BP, including various global roles spanning China, North America and Europe. This culminated in Jeanne being selected to transform BP's safety and operating risk culture following the accident in the Gulf of Mexico known as Deepwater Horizon. Today, Jeanne serves on the board of HF Sinclair and is expanding her non-executive portfolio after stepping down from her Incitec Pivot role. Jeanne, as I said, so fabulous to have you join me. Can I hand over to you and ask, who are you as a human being, Jeanne?
Yeah, those are always the toughest questions, aren't they? But I think, I think all of us are rooted in our past. And so I grew up in the US in the Midwest and had a great foundation. So I'm really blessed to have had very supportive parents that made sure I got a great education. And being Midwestern, we were taught, about the importance of integrity and values, but we also were a little bit more low key. And so, as you think about careers and leadership, that's always a bit of a challenge because, New Yorkers are brash and they get out there, and us Midwesterners, we just sort of like to play it down a bit. And so I think that was rooted in me early on. But one of the things I did learn as I went is that you still have to get noticed, and you've got to do that in a way that's authentic and real for you. But I played basketball and sports growing up and then majored in chemical engineering. And in my mind, that was so that I could get a good job after I graduated. That was kind of how far out I was looking at that time. But I was always very ambitious, goal-oriented, independent, and curious, intellectually curious. And so I think those traits have served me well throughout my career.
Amazing. Jeanne, someone's opinion who I value incredibly highly, who has led at the highest level of organisations herself, said to me, Jeanne Johns is probably one of the best, most rounded CEOs I've ever come across. And I knew that in that instant, I had to find a way to connect with you, to interview you for these series. So how did we build this, humble Midwesterner? How did the career kind of journey navigate you through to the role of MD and CEO?
Yeah, I think, as I think back on it, there's a number of decisions that were made. And I do think there's a bit of intentionality. I always say it's really important to have a plan, but don't ever expect that plan to play out the way you said it or thought it would be. But the plan's really important nonetheless. So when I graduated from chemical engineering, I went to school at Cincinnati. Cincinnati is home to Procter and Gamble, those people that know the consumer goods products. And, that was the biggest company there. And so they interviewed me for all kinds of different divisions for them. But one of the things it dawned on me was that, chemical engineering was not core to what they did. Marketing was core to what they did. And I thought, I am not a marketer. I'm operations, I'm technical. That is not going to be a company where I do anything but sort of do a function that isn't that important to the company. But nonetheless, I did interview with Sohio, which at the time was a regional oil company out of Cleveland, which is where I grew up. And their CEO at the time was a chemical engineer from University of Cincinnati. So at that point, it dawned on me, well, I don't want to be limited in my career based on my degree or where I came from. I only want to be limited by my capabilities and skills. And so I thought Ohio would be right for me. And BP bought out Ohio within a year or so of my joining. And so, so I think the selection of who I joined was really important.
Can I just ask, is that do you feel like you've always been like that? I mean, that's very young. In hindsight, it's young. That's very young to be thinking so maturely about your first role out. Have you always been like that?
I think I have been. I think I've always been reflective and thoughtful.
Mm,
That's one of my characteristics. Some people are sort of out there, push, push, push. And I tend to take things in and think about it and process it.
mm.
And so every time I kind of had a big decision, I looked at the pros and the cons. And then also after doing that, I always look at my emotional reaction to someone suggesting it. So sometimes it'll bug my husband a bit, but I'll ask him about his views. But if he comes back, quote, with the wrong answer, I'll notice my reaction. I was like, no, 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 no. Wait, let me tell you all the reasons I should do the opposite. And so that's the way you kind of make sure your passion, your brain and your heart gets into every decision you make.
Wow, that's fantastic. Okay, so the company's been bought out by BP, and here you are as a chemical engineer, and you downplayed probably in your lovely style you referred to earlier. I mean, you were seriously good at basketball too, right?
I played Division I at University of Cincinnati. Yeah, and like I said, I was a very good student, clearly. And so I joined the company during an economic downturn. And so while chemical engineers were still getting good jobs, you had to go out to the field. There was no headquarter jobs for chemical engineers. So I went to a refinery in Philadelphia. And as I'm there, you're kind of looking around thinking, this is fine, but not really sure this is kind of what I was thinking of and working towards. And I remember my boss at the time, and he was being somewhat facetious, but he said, we're BP now, and BP, if you don't get discovered by the time you're 30, your career is over.
How old were you at this point?
I was about 22, 23.
Okay,
And
so
so
we've
I
got
still
we've got a
had time.
7-year runway.
But because of that, I started thinking about, okay, well, that's the game, I'll need to find a way. And our US headquarters was back in Cleveland. And so I said, I need to get a job in Cleveland, clearly. I'm not going to get discovered at the refinery. And so I found a job back in Cleveland, kind of tried a couple different ones. And then it was really, I didn't know. I didn't have a plan for how I was going. I just knew that I needed to be in the headquarters because everybody senior was there.
Yes.
And probably my breakthrough came. I was doing a job where, I was quite junior. Again, I was 25. No, I was probably older than that, but still I was well below 30.
Mm.
And I was in charge of picking out the crudes and the products for a refinery in New Orleans. And unbeknownst to me, well, first of all, I asked my boss at the time when I took the job, like, what is it that would really, really impress you? I mean, what is it that you'd be thrilled about if I did in this job?
Mm.
And, he thought for a while and he came back and he said, that refinery in New Orleans always, always runs the same crude slate every day, every month. And when we go in the marketplace and buy it, everybody knows what we're going to buy. And we have no ability to get a good price. So I'd like you to expand their crude slate. So I thought, okay, that's a goal. And like I said, I'm goal oriented, so that worked. And I started contacting specialists in the technical department because I had some technical expertise in some units, but these were units I didn't know anything about. And said, okay, if this is their issue, what crudes are going to be a problem. So I worked all that out. And then I went down to the refinery to, I worked with the refinery about their limits, bought new crude for them, went down to this meeting. And in the meeting, unbeknownst to me, the vice president of refining decided to show up. So, so not only did I have the whole management of the refinery there, I also had the head of refining for the US. And so I introduced the new crude, and the manager, ops manager, who was probably, he seemed very old to me at the time, but probably was late 40s,
Yeah.
maybe early 50s, but he seemed old at the time. And he said, we can't run that crude. Don't you understand? We run this, this, and this. And so I went through and I said, well, I went through every explanation. I answered all of his questions and I'd done all my homework. And at the end, he agreed that, yeah, there's no reason he can't run this crude. But that's when I got discovered, so to speak, in the BP world, the ability to not only stand up for what you believe in, but actually kind of change things really made an impression on the higher ups at the time.
I mean, you solved a problem, and there's so many things about that I love. I mean, I love that as you stepped into the role, you went above and beyond by asking what would really thrill you. So you actually got to the heart of the problem, right? Of what, and possibly that leader possibly didn't think it could be done either. So, you've then transformed the way that they operated. So that's incredible. So that got you noticed, I guess, because you were solving something. What opportunities did that bring your way beyond that point?
Yeah, I think it was so key because at that point you had a lot more opportunities. And so I always thought about every career move. Like I said, there was always a plan, but most of the jobs I got, I never had in mind. But nonetheless, each one, I always thought about what's the degree of stretch here. And I thought that always I wanted something that was interesting, that would stretch me. I'd learn new things, but also not something that, I thought I didn't have the skills to achieve it. And so that degree of stretch, I think, is really important. And so, I looked at, what transferable skills do I have and does that fit? What geography is this? Do I speak the language? What things do I need to build up in my career? So things like leadership skills, how big of an organization will I be running? Because you need to be able to run a big organization to go up the ladder. Do I have P&L accountability? That's important. And so, is it a what's the business model? Is it a single site, a big refinery I'm running, or is it a distributed one? Does it is it manufacturing, or does it go all the way to the customer? So anyhow, I tried to build an intentional career that brought in all those aspects.
I was going to ask you, Jeanne, but I feel like you answered it. I was going to ask you, did you always want to be a CEO? And as I was thinking about it, I thought, well, you chose the organization based on the fact that the CEO of the company came from the same university and had the same background. But I'll ask anyway, do you think ultimately that was always part of your vision or your view that you could get to a role like that?
I think it always was. It was always aspirational. It wasn't a single endpoint that I, kind of knew or wanted, or, but I did know early on that I didn't just want to be a chemical engineer.
Yes.
I didn't want to be restricted to a technical ladder. Very important that people do that. But for me, I wanted to have that breadth. I love the breadth of a CEO job. You can talk to investors one day, you're talking to your R&D scientists the next day, you're talking to the board, you're talking to the government. But that breadth of the job is something that really excites me. There's a lot to, you always are learning.
Can you think of a couple of pivotal moments? I mean, you've just shared one with your transformation of that and changing the crude oil that plant was using. Can you think of other pivotal moments in your career?
Yeah, I mean, there's no such pivotal moments that there isn't that little gulp in your throat that you get that scared feeling right away. But I do remember I was much further along in my career at this point, but I just happened to be visiting headquarters in London at the time. And there was always these big segment reviews that were always, high pressure, with Lord Brown at the time, who was our CEO. And, I normally don't attend those. I was one level down from there. But because I was in town, my boss said, hey, why don't you come along? It'd be good exposure for you to see what happens in these. And so I did indeed go to that. And, they had carved out a little speaking role for me that I was all prepared for. And, but then things went off track. And when Laura Brown was asking, my direct supervisor about his 10-point plan, or I think it was 6-point plan on safety, my boss didn't know it. And I didn't know that it was even called a 6-point plan. I do remember him talking about it, but I didn't remember exactly it in that terminology. But, as my boss is stumbling and, Laura Brown's getting very annoyed, it gets thrown over to me. And, and like I said, that little lump in your throat starts because I'm thinking, oh boy, this is a hot potato. And while I couldn't remember all 6 at that time, I was thinking, I can remember quite a few of those. So let me just get started. And so I started on the ones I knew about. And it was really funny because at the next break, someone took me aside and goes, did you see what happened when you started answering? He said, you could see Lord Brown just sit back in his chair and start to relax. And, after I got through 3 or 4, he was kind of helping me to make sure that I got all 6. But the thing really, the lesson is, first of all, you do need to be prepared for things, but you also need to be able to start from, what do I know? Not what is it that I don't know? Because I could have started off by saying, Lord Brown, I just don't remember all of those.
Yes.
Instead, I chose to start with what I did know, and it worked out fine.
Even that mindset of I'll start with what I do know, relaxes you into the conversation. I mean, if you'd started with that blinking what I don't know, you can only imagine how that would have translated. Do you know, there's a couple of things I love about that, Jeanne. I love that your leader took you into that room. Regardless, you may have been handed the hospital hand pass with the pick up this question, but I love that they took you into the room. I say that they're the moments I learnt the most in my career, was getting the chance to get into that.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the challenges, especially with remote working now, because you just don't know when those moments will come up. I didn't plan my visit to London to coincide. It just so happened I had something else I needed to do. And so being around, being available, and just volunteering when you do. This time I was asked, but I didn't even hesitate. I'm like, oh yeah, I'm in. And that's really important.
So let's talk about stepping into the CEO role then. So how did that opportunity come about? And I guess what was your sort of decision criteria, getting to understand you a little more in terms of weighing all of that up? What was the decision criteria around that?
Yeah, well, I had finished my BP career. I sort of felt like I had done everything I wanted to. And so, and right before I left BP, I joined a board. And so I left with one non-exec role when I left. And I came back to the US. I'd been in the UK for 5 years at that point. And I always remember I told my husband, we're going back to the US. We're going to stay there for a while because we had been on the road a lot. And not to worry, I'm set. And so when I left, the best advice I got, to be honest, was from the CEO of BP at the time. And I remember him telling me, don't jump into anything right away, Jeanne. Put some distance between BP and your next thing. Because, you just need that time, because otherwise you'll jump into the wrong thing. And I thought that was excellent advice, because I think those of us who are very achievement oriented, likes to get involved, likes to do things, it's really hard just to sit back and say, well, I'm just not going to do that much for a while. Yeah. But I eventually joined a second board, and, things were going quite well. I really got approached by a headhunter for the CEO role. And I remember, again, it goes back to what do you know and what don't you know? My first thing is I actually don't know fertilizers or explosives. It's like, that's not for me. I'm oil. I've done a lot of things in oil. I did refining, I did upstream, I did midstream, I did pipelines, I did a lot of things in oil and gas, but I've never done this. And then I read through the job description and what skills they were looking for. And all of a sudden I said, well, there's a big component of a commodity and managing a commodity cycle. Big component on safety, as you can imagine. You don't want to do explosives without being, very secure on safety. Operational risk was really important. Doing a business that went from manufacturing to B2B. I ran businesses like that. I ran multi-billion-dollar businesses that, was that same business model. And so as I went through the list of all the transferable skills, I thought, actually, this is a pretty good fit.
Mm.
And like I said, I always thought that it'd be fun and, great learning experience to be CEO. Australia seemed like a lovely place to go. It was a little far. Not quite the US, I promised my husband. Luckily, he's a good, he loves golf, and Australia was a good fit. And so anyhow, so we decided that, yeah, I'd throw my name in the hat. I hesitated for a while, but, I said, I'm either in or I'm not. And so the first thing I wanted to do is make sure that it was genuine. As much as I hate to say it, anytime you're a diversity candidate, you're always a little worried that, you're the one diverse candidate when they've already made their mind.
Yes.
And so I did want to make sure that that wasn't the case. And, but once they convinced me of that, I said, okay, I'm all in. And that's when I really found out how important my professional network was. Because I tapped into that. I thought about, okay, here are all the things I do, I know well, no worries. Here's the things I don't know so well, investor relations. Who do I know that really knows investor relations? Let me give her a call. And I don't know, I lost track of her, but I stayed in touch with this person who does keep in track. So I really tied into my professional network to actually think through and, before the interview, so that I really felt like I had the bases covered to some extent.
Jeanne, I want to ask you, I come across a lot of people who've had lengthy careers in one organisation, and it's going to become increasingly less common, I think. But I do come across a lot of people who've had very lengthy careers like you did in BP. And they get to the end of that and they find that their network isn't as diverse as it should be. Did you find that, or were you always intentional about sort of having a network outside of BP as well? I'd love to hear about that.
Yeah, I think it was somewhere in between. I mean, I think first of all, I often wondered why I stayed so long with BP. But, for 20 years, not once did I really consider leaving, only because BP kept bringing up new and interesting career choices.
Yes.
So I really did so many different things with BP that it didn't feel like 30 years.
No.
As far as networking, I kept in good touch with a number of people that left BP for various reasons. And so I kept that network. And then after I left, I reached out to a lot of them and, met up with them. Houston's a great place if you're from the oil and gas industry. I had numerous coffees with people, and then they introduced me to other people. And so now, you extended your network outside of BP. So I wouldn't say I'm a great networker, but I will say that I did have foundations in place to build on.
Yeah. And I imagine, just from the short time we've spent together, that probably the networks you do build are quite deep.
Yeah, no, and I have to say, the one thing that really impressed me after I left BP was how supportive everybody that was former BP was. Like, I call them up and it's like, I know you know who I am, but it's been a long time, and and I'm kind of asking you a favor. And everybody was just so generous with their time. But I do think that some of that is, I would do the same for them, and I think they know.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I think people are surprised at that. People are like, well, of course I would give my time to other people, but they're constantly surprised people will do it in return.
That's right.
Yeah, it's amazing. People are. Jeanne, can I take you back then to, stepping into the CEO role? And do you remember the first, period of
Yeah.
time?
I remember it very well. I don't think anybody, I doubt any CEO ever does forget it. But I think, unfortunately, mine was particularly memorable. So I started, and I was still just moving over, still getting furniture in the house, and unfortunately, within a week, I was still doing I did the first investor roadshow. The board decided that kind of the old CEO would actually close the books, but then the presentation the CFO would do, and I would sort of tag along. Which, there's no perfect time
No.
to start a job. So it worked as well as anything. But, we were on the road trip, and all of a sudden, as rumors went around, we had lost a big contract to BHP. And like I said, I wasn't even in the job yet, really. And yet we had this crisis on our hands, especially because we had a take or pay supply contract. Losing a big customer is bad enough, but if you have the raw material to back up that contract, and now you don't have that contract, now you're really in trouble. So, all of that was inherited, but anyhow, it was a very rocky start from that perspective.
Yes.
But I do think that, I just had so much experience in managing different things through BP, and I just said, okay, you play the cards you're dealt. You don't get to pick the cards that you were dealt, and then you find your way through that. And so it was quite unusual. I had full intentions of doing my 90-day plan. 90 days, just go out, listen to the organization, understand where they're at, decide where I want to take the company, all that other stuff, and
boom,
end up,
life happens.
Life happens. Like I said, you always make a plan, but you always know it's not really going to work out that way.
Do you have a moment in your tenure? I mean, I could have a million questions about this, but do you have a moment in your tenure as CEO that stands out where you just felt really proud? Just so it's all coming together here.
Yeah, I mean, well, I think one of them had to be, as we were emerging from the pandemic, and and it's a little known additive to diesel, AdBlue, that actually China stopped exporting, and there was this global shortage, and nobody could get their hands on. And so, those are the times that, and this is one of the things I love about manufacturing people. They are so dedicated, so loyal. When there's a call to do something important, they pull out all stops. And so our plant at Gibson Island absolutely, went all in, and it was over Christmas holidays.
Yes.
But had they not done that and figured out a way to make more, because for a while there we were supplying all of Australia AdBlue, and we didn't know how to do it. First time I got a call from the government, I was like, yeah, no, we can't do that. We can do a bid, but we can't do it. And then all of a sudden, as we found out more, it's like, well, the trucks and the mining equipment, all the diesel equipment, those engines won't run unless they have this additive. And it could have been a national emergency.
Yes.
And I always talk to, somewhat facetiously, but the Grinch was really threatening to ruin Christmas for us. And you know, everybody in the plant, they worked extra hours, they put in all sorts of temporary loading facilities and figured out how to do it.
How did you lead that, Jeanne? How did you lead that time from that phone call and that initial, I don't think we can do this. How did you lead that?
Well, you know, I remember the exact time. Of course, we were on a video call. And I remember the exact time when the penny dropped that, you know, this isn't a request.
Yes.
You know, I mean, it's like, you know, you're asking if I can do this. No, no, no. You're saying, you know, we
Do
need
this.
this. What can we do? And it really was, well, first of all, it was that mindset. At that point, wasn't about, you know, what will it take? And you know, you no longer thought about, you know, kind of budgets or costs or anything. You actually talked about what would it take.
Mm.
And to be fair, I really gave a lot of space to somebody who I knew was a can-do kind of guy.
Brilliant.
And I just said, you know, just make it happen.
Yeah.
You know, come keep me up to date, you know, all this stuff. And I was like all across it, but really I had to empower the team. You know,
Mm.
it involved so many different things and whatnot that really you just had to pick the right people to lead it.
I love that. CEOs cannot have all the answers. There's just much, far too much to be across. So, what surprised you about the CEO role? Did anything surprise you about it?
Um, no, I mean, it was a great learning experience, all sorts of different ways. I mean, I think the only thing people say it, and you know, until you experience it, it's always different. But you know, people always say about it being lonely, and it is a bit lonely. You know, you like to share with other people everything, and you know, there's times that you're sort of like, you know, can I really share that? You know, this is probably best left to me. So you know, really finding people you could confide in, and still be kind of authentic and available to people inside the organization. But it wasn't like a BP, because in the BP world, you know, I always had a network of friends that were in different parts that really had no idea
Yeah.
that, you know, that you could touch base with if you needed something. And you know, here you were like, well, really, there isn't anybody in this organization. And I think the other thing is you underestimate how hard it is to really get, I wouldn't say the truth, but really get that feedback from inside the organization. You know,
Yes.
again, when I was with BP, somebody was going to give me a ring if I was going off track. You know, I had lots of friends and lots of allies, and you know, I didn't realize at the time, but
Yeah.
you know, there was a lot of feedback you'd get in lots of different ways
How
that,
did you, Jeanne? I think it's such a critical thing you bring up, and I've asked it of other people. How did you get that unfiltered feedback that you need?
well, you know, it took a while, first of all. I mean, you know, I started off by getting mentors outside, you know, one or two that, you know, were outside the organization. But then again, you know, they're not in the organization. And so you do try and build up, you know, people that, you know, that you trust, you know, that are, and that
Yeah.
they trust you to handle it the right way. And so over time, you do learn that, but it's not fast. It takes a while for people to say, you know, I don't want to bring you in on this, you
Yeah.
know, and you know, and really finding that right balance with people.
While we're on feedback, I just wonder, is there any, I think there's a tricky relationship with feedback, broadly speaking. I think people don't seek it out enough. They're sort of defensive about it when they get it, and I think a lot of leaders aren't comfortable giving it. But is there feedback you needed to hear along the way that you did hear that you think helped your growth?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you know, every feedback, you know, is a reflection of the individual giving the feedback and you.
Yes.
And so I think it's really important to try and unpick that to some extent. Um, and I always remember, and this goes back to one of the dichotomies of female leadership, is that because when I started off by saying, I'm no different. I'm just a leader. I'm going to like be gender neutral. But you don't realize that, it's not about what you think. Everybody coming to you sees you as female,
Yeah.
first and foremost. And
Yes.
so they bring all expectations of how you should lead and how you should be. And it's not just about Jeanne, it's about, a woman CEO.
Yeah.
And then you're like, oh, okay, I'm not sure what a woman CEO does. I know what
Well,
Jeanne does. But,
it's not always been easy to find them, Jeanne, so people aren't sure.
And so, but I remember one feedback I got, once because, I had entered a meeting with, we were preparing for a turnaround. It was in a plant, so it was in my comfort zone. But I just felt that the team there was so complacent about, they were missing every single milestone here. And they kept saying, oh, no, 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 don't worry, we'll pull this out. No, 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 don't worry. Which, again, in your background conversation, you're a little bit saying, you're not really taking me seriously here. And so I thought about, how to handle that. And I thought about all my other bosses and all that. And, in the moment, I decided, I'm just going hard on this one. You know what I mean? They're not paying attention. And I don't have time, to take their leader aside and tell him and hope he translates that. And, I'm just going to go in hard. And, I was very, very firm.
Mm.
In hindsight, I think they thought aggressive. But
Yes.
in my mind, I was being very firm. They weren't listening. They weren't taking it seriously. And, I was going to make sure they did. Now the interesting thing is, as things turns out, they got the kick in the butt. They got into gear, and we had a great turnaround. So I thought, check,
Yep.
good job.
Yep.
And then I got the feedback was like, wow, you were like so out of line there. And I thought a lot about that. And and to this day, I still think about it sometimes. But I think again, what I learned is it's really hard for women to exercise hard power because
Yes.
I had seen men do worse.
Yes.
I'd been kicked in the butt, any number of times. And, afterwards, I kind of reflect on it and say, okay, maybe I was being a little complacent there, And, but I think it had a bigger leadership cost to me than I realized in the moment.
Mm.
And so, you always have to keep that in mind as you calibrate, using hard leadership.
Fascinating. I think you're right. I think we have to learn how to lean so much more onto influence than that sort of hard directive power, even though I'm sure it was exactly the right decision at the right moment to get the outcome that was needed. Yeah, brilliant. So reflection, we're sort of a year on from stepping away from the CEO role, and we're focused on, well, in non-executive and growing non-executive roles. Do you reflect back on leaving the role, your time in the role? Like, where are you at with all of that now? And congratulations on all of your incredible achievements.
Yeah. Well, I think, there's a time and a space for everything, and when I went to Australia, like I said, after I left BP, I thought 5, 7 years, tops. And so it was about the right time. But really, what changed was that, my passion and where I want to take the company and what the board was thinking just diverged. And it just, it was the right time. And so, so I often think about, I would have loved to have taken the company where I thought it should go, as I felt very passionately that I had the right strategy. But nonetheless, when that diverged, you just have to move on and say, good luck to everybody.
Yes.
And it's time to move on. And so I think that, so it was a fascinating time, from the early emergencies, operating through COVID, which was, certainly unbelievable.
Yes.
And then really post-COVID, really hitting strategy hard, because coming out of COVID, that was really my mindset, like, oh my goodness, my 5 years is up.
Yes.
And I didn't get as far as I had hoped because, well, lots of things happened.
Yeah.
But I really wanted to get after the strategy, which I did, and provided the options available. So I'm really, proud of having provided the options. Ultimately the board has to make the decisions they think that they want to make. But I'm really proud of the options I put in front of the board and really felt as though, the people did such a fabulous job in getting some of those options worked. It was a fantastic time in some ways, and so, like I said, it's you close one chapter and you start the next one.
Would you do it all again?
Absolutely,
Yeah.
no regrets. No
Yeah.
regrets.
Yeah.
So it was a great time. It's we enjoyed our time in Australia. It's great people. It was fascinating. It wasn't exactly, laid out the way I thought it would be, but absolutely no regrets.
Do you think more females should step forward for CEO roles?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Why?
Yeah, I think, well, I just think that, the talent pool isn't concentrated in one gender. And so, so it should be about half.
Yeah.
That's my simple arithmetic. So every time someone says 30%, I'm going, that's interesting. 30% is an interesting number. I don't know why 30%. But talent is equally spread. And I also think that diverse workforces in general, I think there's a balance that comes in there. And I think they, if meshed correctly, I think they'll be higher performing any day.
Jeanne, I could not be more thrilled to have had this chance to dig into this conversation with you. I want to ask the final question that I ask everyone, even though I'm so tempted to just go and go and go. We may have to do part 2 and 3. But the final question I ask everybody is, what does brave feminine leadership mean to you, and do you think it needs to change?
Well, I'll start with the word feminine, because I think, for me, that has all kinds of connotations on style. And so I prefer the word female because I'm certainly female. Feminine's in the eye of the beholder. And as I think about style, I think that one of the challenges for women is that there's an expectation that they lead as a woman, whatever that means. And I think there's all kinds of different women leaders, just like there's all kinds of male leaders. And I look forward to the day that, female leaders can have a broader scope, can use the hard power and the influence, and can use both of those tools just as freely as men do. When you say brave, I think about courageous, and I think we all have to be courageous at various times. I think that, when I talked about the strategy, I knew it was a high risk, but I absolutely was convinced it was the right thing to do. It was the right thing for the company. And it was the agreed strategy. And, you put yourself out there, and if the board disagrees, then they disagree, but you do it because it's the right thing to do. And so I think that, I think it always takes courage. I think sometimes it takes more courage for women. And so again, my hope and vision for the future is that there's a day that, yes, you still have to be courageous, but no more than a man has to be courageous in the same role.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Jeanne.
Thank you, Melissa. I enjoyed